Hello, this is Franco Collins for Tuesday the 7th of January 2014. Well, thanks for listening and reading, and Happy New Year to all of you, and may you and your families and friends have the very best fortune and joy for the coming year. Well, tonight the topic I wish to discuss is 2014 and the Remission of Mundi, with Mundi being originally the Latin word for the underworld and not world. The term in Latin for world was orbis, or the world as in the earth was orbis terrum, or a theoretical world was universitas. The Latin word mundi or mundus always meant underworld. In contrast, the term remission comes from the Latin word remissio, meaning to let go, release, forgive, abate, or heal. So another way of describing the topic tonight is 2014 and the forgiveness and healing of the underworld. Or another way of describing the topic tonight is ending the insane model of hell on earth in 2014. Well, in a moment, I will get to the origins of the word mundi further, and why it never meant simply world to the Romans and those elite members of secret societies. I will also explain how and why the word mundi came to be deliberately corrupted into claiming to mean world or mankind or universe or nature. I will also explain why mundi does not mean the concept of spiritual hell, but a mid-state, a third state between heaven and earth, from which the phrase axis mundi comes from in ancient Roman belief. But first, I want to explain the reason and timing for discussing such a topic, and what I hope all of you who read or listen will gain from the topic tonight, and why this topic is so relevant and sobering to each and every one of us and our collective future. So why are we discussing the topic of mundi? I've chosen this topic, which revisits several elements we've been discussing over the years, namely the extraordinary power of the mind, especially if we consider the idea that all life is a dream and all existence is a dream, and we are part of the ultimate dreamer and the absolute dreamer personified. The topic chosen tonight will also touch on the elements we have discussed in the past concerning the danger of delusional and contradictory ideas that promote mental illness through conflict, uncertainty, guilt, self-loathing, greed, hate, and of course, fear. That such systems of ideas such as nihilism and neoconservative selfish ignorance are not simply bad. They can infect the mind of adherents in this life and the next. Which leads us into the more controversial of subjects we have discussed in the past regarding the absolute existence of ghosts or disembodied spirits in a model of unique collective awareness. but also that since the 16th century, certain philosophers and secret societies have sought a kind of pseudo-immortality in the worship and promotion of this ghost energy to manifest the concept of Mundi, or the matrix of insanity, which is holding the world hostage today. What I am speaking about is the systematic and deliberate creation of a third world, a world between heaven and earth, that certain men of power who feared heaven believed they could control, and in turn future generations of their followers believed they could ultimately merge this world with the first world of life on earth to create hell on earth, or at least the world of the underworld, the undead, the world of corporations. We've spoken about the fact that since the 16th century and the creation of the Sestake V trusts, or the argument that the government can create a temporary testimony estate in your name and assume you to be lost, abandoned, dead, a ward, insane, a lunatic and a criminal, is the creation of Mundi. We've also spoken about the fact that when people go to court, under the assumption of pro se, it means pro se in rem, or simply standing as a thing, meaning a soulless and mindless object that can be shipped around and put in storage or prison or monetized through a bond. Or if through a solicitor or attorney, then in personam, meaning a human being and a soulless creature, a legal person, and therefore dead entity, and under the complete control of the courts. And since we first explained when this happened, why this happened, and all the acts of law and statutes that prove it happened, there has been many tens of thousands of people that have gone on to prove the truth of this research. The point being that all of this is predicated on believing the living are dead. And what kind of madness believes people who are living are dead? And what kind of insanity causes people living in the richest countries of the world to vote to cut the benefits of poor so that they starve to death and then hide from public view how many thousands of people are dying from exposure and starvation? And what kind of utter insanity and bizarre stupidity creates a system where the government makes more money locking up its citizens under fake prison bonds through privatised prisons than find people useful jobs and education? It is not enough to say these things happen because politicians have stopped caring or have become so totally stupid and insane that they really have no idea. I happened to work in Canberra, the capital city of Australia, in politics for around 6 years and interacted with politicians firsthand during this period. So I can say from my own personal experience that politicians are by and large less intelligent and less aware than your average merchant banker or top lawyer or real estate agent or military, industrial or pharmaceutical business mogul. But they are rarely suicidal or completely disconnected from their constituents, the ones that keep them in power, to which they have become accustomed. But what if this madness is not a cause, but an effect? An effect of a deliberate and systematic plan to create a model of hell on earth, or the Mundi model. A deliberate strategy of control, of curse, of damnation, and of mental illness. And this is why discussing Mundi in more than just a journey into historic madness, but a necessary exposure of the undeniable fact that religious and political leaders planned and executed the goal of creating hell on earth. So what has any of this got to do with you or me? And with any of us? Well, in fact, this topic of Mundi affects almost everything in our life. Why do bad things seem to keep happening? Or bad fortune? Why do people not see the same knowledge and common sense as you? Why are people living their lives on autopilot? Why are so many talented and bright children committing suicide in first world countries? Why do some people seem incapable of self-control and feelings and are plagued by images of horrendous violence and depravity? And why are we living in a world literally becoming like zombies? Is it only diet? Or electromagnetic radiation? Or pollutants? Or something more? In past generations, people would have wrongly called it demonic possession. And in fact, I have heard that a few people are desperately trying to push that line again. I hope it fails, because this energy, this insanity and madness revels in the idea that people would consider it demonic when it is in fact very much Homo sapien. The point is that things are far from balanced, and it seems many times that the people around us and those with whom we interact are like empty vessels, possessed by sometimes crazed and heartless spirits. Now, the trained nihilist, the pure academic produced from the universities dedicated to denying the existence of the supernatural or the existence of the divine creator and heaven, and even our deep spiritual connection throughout civilization until the past 200 years, will almost certainly have a rational explanation for all that we have raised. It will be because of chemical imbalances, they may say, or faulty perception, they may say, or wrong assumptions, or miscommunication, or incompetence, or some combination. But nowhere will such thinking take into account that we live within a collective reality, a collective model called Mundi, specifically designed to inflict hell on earth through scarcity, constant war, genocide, hatred, racism, depressions, recessions, elitism. The idea that a specific model was deliberately introduced to condemn the world to slavery and madness more than 450 years ago, if ever raised, will simply be dismissed by these people as ridiculous conspiracies at best, or the ramblings of unstable minds at worst. Well, in a moment, we will look at the proof that not only was the model of hell on earth via Mundi implemented 450 years ago, but it remains entrenched within the fabric of Western Roman society today. Worse still is the idea that not only can such a model of insanity affect us when we are alive, but may condemn us into servitude after we leave our bodies if we fail to clear our minds of the control mechanisms of the Mundi model. That is, people who are obsessed in wealth and incapable of reconnecting to their heart, compassion and genuine love and care of other people. Or people who have become ensnared by religious and spiritual cults or fads or new age, speaking of gobbledygook and waffle that have absolutely no bearing on true spiritual growth. And people who have lost trust in society and everyone else and have become islands and isolated and very much alone, therefore easy pickings. Well, some may still cling to the Hollywood notion that when one dies, everything is fine, and the good people go to heaven and the bad people go to hell. Yet the workings of human consciousness in a universal dream is far more complex, and that is why the risk of entrapment by mind virus and contradictory thinking, out of control ego, is a very real risk for many. It is also why we live in the most untrustworthy, shallow, and ego-driven time for more than 1900 years, and why so many are dying and becoming ghosts of Mundi, the underworld. For example, I was attacked by a fellow suffering extreme mental illness 2 weeks ago, who considered that after I had spent 30 years of research and publishing, and that I'd written many books and produced over 60 websites and nearly 1 million web pages, and I'd registered more than 6 patents in the use of Ucadia in a company to help fund ongoing research, that he could claim the name Ucadia and register it with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, even though he does not own the mark, nor is authorised to do so. I mean, what drives such madness? Or is there some energy, some consciousness that is contributing to this level of interference or masking of the ideas? So how do we make sense of all of this? How do we find some kind of bearing, some benchmark by which we make sense? Well, to do this, let us return to the notion of what is life and existence from what we have learnt from the Ucadia model. Well, if you have been reading the Journey of UCA or the Journey of Self on Ucadia.com, as well as the Sacred Covenant Pactum de Singularis Caelum, then you would already know that the Ucadia model is predicated on the key knowledge that life is a dream. But a dream has rules. And these rules can be fully identified and understood. And if you have also looked at the canons of law on one-heaven.org, such as sovereign law and the history of Commonwealth law, beginning in the 16th century, then you'll also know that the idea that life is a dream, but a dream has rules, is not a new idea. It is an idea and key knowledge that goes way back to the time of the Hyksos pharaohs, who originated the knowledge of Kabbalah as the migration of the soul and spirit towards enlightenment. When the Library of Alexandria was finally sacked and destroyed under the siege of the Umayyad Islamic Caliphate, such priceless texts and material, some still written in Greek, were transported eastwards, first to Morocco, and then across the Straits of Gibraltar. Sorry. Sorry for that. Well, so it's transported across to Morocco and then across the Straits of Gibraltar to form the basis of one of the greatest libraries of the first millennium at Cordoba in Spain. So when Cordoba finally fell to the Pisan commercial empire in the 12th century, the scholars of Pisa and then Venice discovered not only a wealth of knowledge in Arabic, but some of the priceless treasures from the original library of Alexandria. This, of course, became the basis of the legends of the treasures of the Knights Templar. Not in gold, but in wisdom. And by the way, the Knights Templar was an order of bankers founded by Pisan Doge Pietro Morosini in the 11th century, known as Ordo Pauperes Templum, or the Order of the Poor of the Money Temple. So there is the obvious connection between Pisa, Cordoba texts, and the Templar treasure. And we know this history is true because in the 13th century, we begin to see an emergence of occult mysticism taking hold across Europe and exploding at the time of the first printed books in the 15th century, reintroducing Hyksos knowledge of the Kabbalah and the illumination that life is a dream. And the rules of the dream can be discovered and even manipulated or distorted to create your own illusion of reality. Now, despite the mental illness and madness mentioned earlier of people coming out of the woodwork to claim Ucadia and other things for which they do not own and have no authority, you hopefully realise by now that the Ucadia model is about opening people up to this knowledge of the universe in all its possibilities and to create heaven on earth. Heaven on earth. But at the time of the occult rabbi and other scholars at Cordoba and other sites in Europe, history tells us that it was far more about controlling this incredible knowledge and hiding it for all but the highest intellects. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a genius to realise that at some point, merchant bankers and other people seeking to control trade, politics and religions were going to connect the dots and realise that a wholly artificial reality could be introduced to the masses whereby white is black, black is white, and reality can be suspended. In fact, over the past 60 years, we have proof showing through various mind control programs that once you can convince people to suspend their common sense, then you're able to do all kinds of perverse manipulation and corruptions of mind, or simply mind programming. I'm going to propose to you that, contrary to the revisionist historians, the concept of the world being flat as enforced by the Roman cult at the Vatican and European powers hundreds of years ago was an early and crude example of introducing a wholly artificial model of reality, conceived in the mind of the bankers and slave traders to control the world. And while the model of the world as an actual chessboard was unsustainable, the esoteric notion continues even today. If life is a dream, and those religious leaders and merchant bankers and elite comprehended this notion more than 450 years ago to create the artificial world of Mundi and hell on earth, what then might help us with our knowledge of the mind and afterlife? Well, if you've read the canons of cognitive law, then we have some excellent insights into understanding the complex relation between mind and our physical bodies and the awareness in the dream that is existence. Now, I won't read out all these canons, but I refer to you Canon 675, 677, that mind is equivalent to the concept of consciousness and awareness. In Canon 678, that mind is non-locational. That means whenever they have tested mind, they can see the brain working, but they can't pin where the mind is physically located within the brain. Which is why psychiatry and other nihilist philosophies have sought to render the mind as merely an effect, which of course is an absurdity, the ghost in the machine, which is an absolute absurdity, because they cannot explain their model, their nihilist model, the fact that mind exists, I think, I doubt, therefore I am, and yet you cannot prove the physical location of the mind. And further, if we have a look at Canon 679, we see that we can define mind beyond just a singularity, but we might define mind as lower mind, or the physically constrained mind, the apparatus of the brain, higher mind or higher self, the I, and then divine mind. So from these canons we can see that mind is non-locational because it's already immortal and merely connected through to the body, not actually within this dimension. But furthermore, that we possess more than one mind, and the I you think you are is higher mind, that is then connected to lower physical mind while you are alive. Well, what then does the Ucadia model tell us about death? Let us have a look at a few of the canons in cognitive law, and again, I'm not going to read them out, but I'm going to mention them. In Canon 789 give us an insight that physical death is the disconnection, the end of the lower mind, but the continued existence of the higher mind and the divine mind. And in Canon 791 we see that depending upon how our mind has been educated and how aware our mind is, we may experience different effects at the appointment of death. And as a consequence, if we are isolated and separate in our thinking, if we deny the existence of a higher world, if we shut ourselves out, if we close ourselves down, all of which is built into the Mundi model, then we may in fact find ourselves at the point of physical death, existing in a state of being a ghost. Well, what then are these foundational ideas that created the Mundi model of madness and hell on earth? Well, thankfully, they are clear and we can go through them. And I won't go through all of them because there's quite a bit of detail to them, but I refer you to Article 131. Article 131 of the Canons of Sovereign Law on the website one-heaven.org. And when you go there, you'll see that there is listed under Canon 6465 22 specific beliefs of the Roman cult and of the Protestant Christian religions from the 16th century that are the foundation of Mundi. As I said, I won't go through each of them in detail, but I will name some of them as you go through. Transubstantiation is one. The concept, in contradiction to all physical laws, that something may change from ethereal to supernatural to physical and vice versa. In Mundi, the concept of Underworld is brought in to play at this point, and then the word is deliberately misconstrued to claim that it means world, when it never did. But through people's ignorance and blind faith, they believed what they were told. The reincarnation of spirit and the exclusiveness of that only to the elite, and to deny to the masses that they even have a soul, that the vast majority of people were depreciated to become animals, and by the 19th century were depreciated again to become soulless and mindless animals, things. Think about that. Mundi, in its first 250 years, depreciated us from men and women to become animals, humans, soulless. And then the bankers saw this as such a great idea, they took it a step further to call us mindless and soulless, to become things and commodities. Peccatum originale, original sin. One of the most abhorrent, insane, untruthful, heretical abominations to all history, to all faith, to all civilization. And yet today it remains a foundation of Christian belief. Utter madness and insanity. And thus a key foundation of Mundi. Magister Mundi laborare. The teacher of the world is suffering, that the world is suffering, and thus the world is hell. That our life is to suffer. Not joy, not to learn, but to toil. And thus you find in the Protestant work ethic the idea that you begin work and you work your entire life and then you die. And your reward is in heaven. What utter rubbish. Madness. insanity, where this was applied in places clearly able of sustaining and prosperity. The fact that the United States of America has more than enough resources that everyone could be well fed and everyone could live happily. And yet we see bankers and merchants and clinically insane religious leaders still promoting the concept that we must labour and toil, we must suffer. Salvatio, salvation or salvage. That we are something to be salvaged. And thus the commercial concept built within the sacraments. Incredibly perverse, incredibly deluded, incredibly insane, and thus the foundation again of Mundi. Omnes debita esse solvenda. All debts to the ferryman must be paid. The concept that we must pay for our debts and the debts that we inherit through original sin. Corporations, funeral rites of dead corpuses, persona, death masks, Corpus Christi, the body of the dead Christ. All these perversions, all this madness put front and centre to destabilise our minds, to keep us in a loop and to curse us in this life and the next. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that not only were these doctrines the cornerstone of Mundi and brought into play in the 16th century through the Council of Trent to the Roman cult, but the fact that these doctrines were first field tested in the Protestant movement first, before being adopted by the Roman cult second at the Council of Trent. Now, let me repeat that so it's clear, because I know many may not believe or may not even believe what they heard. I'm going to say it again. The Protestant churches were the breeding grounds for the perversion of Christian thinking, the development of Mundi, the development of the idea, the perversion that life is hell on earth, and the development of the heresies against the teachings of Jesus first. Then, once perfected, they were adopted by the mothership of madness, the Roman cult, at the Council of Trent. Now, if you don't believe me, then the next links I've got here in the article and in the audio will prove that to you under Canon 6522. Let's take baptism. Baptism was not confirmed, I repeat, was not confirmed as an official sacrament of the Catholic Church, nor one of its first rituals, until the seventh session of the Council of Trent in March 1547. Yet was confirmed as a sacrament under Martinus Lieder, or Luther, through the Augsburg Confession of Faith in June 1530, a full 17 years before the Vatican. Confirmation was not confirmed as an official sacrament by the Vatican, nor its first ritual until the seventh session in March 1547. The Eucharist was not confirmed as an official sacrament until the 13th session of the Council of Trent in 1551, yet it was already confirmed as a sacrament under Martinist leader Martin Luther through the Augsburg Confession of Faith in 1530. 21 years. 21 years before the Catholic Church. And it was in fact published as a key element of the protest faith as early as 1526, before the Catholic Church. Penance or confession was not confirmed as an official sacrament of the Catholic Church until the 14th session of the Council of Trent in 1551. And yet again, it was through the Augsburg Confession of Faith in Protestants. An original sin was not confirmed as a doctrine of the Catholic Church until the 5th session of the Council of Trent, and yet it was implanted within the Augsburg Confession of Faith of Martin Luther in 1530, before the Catholic Church. Now, I've included in the reference articles the history behind this so you can see it. But by listing that, what we state clearly is the foundation of Mundi, the origin of Mundi and the motivation of Mundi. If you've been reading, listening to Ucadia and the Covenant of One Heaven, then you'll be aware that last year was the year of redemption and the final fourth year of a supremely sacred and historic event whereby heaven and earth were healed and the transgression of the past were forgiven. And given the continued violence and aggression and madness and incompetence, you could be forgiven into thinking that nothing's happened, when in fact we have in fact witnessed a seismic change and event. The ghost energy has not yet dissipated. The madness of nihilist philosophies is still driving our academic and financial and social worlds. And people are still gritted into thinking and using models of hell. And people are still acting as empty vessels. And they still find themselves influenced by this ghost energy, particularly women. But it is changing, bit by bit, and the Ucadia model is revealing how we can live in trust and respect, how we can address issues of community and society, and how we can overcome and remove the last veils of insanity. But most importantly, as I have said to you in the past, to name a thing for what it is to take its power. And the time has come for the remission, for the healing, for the ending of Mundi in 2014. I hope and trust you will help and support in any way you can this year. And my heartfelt thanks goes out to those of you who still find a way and are able to help and support and donate to the continuing work of Ucadia. I look forward to the legal work we do this year. I look forward to the completion of the charters. I look forward to the feedback and support of all of you who continue to learn through Ucadia. Thank you and good night.